Hello fellow young wildlife photographers, and welcome to our first edition of editing tutorials. I'm Luca Tomlinson, one of the admins here at YWP, and in this tutorial I'll be going over the basics on how to edit in Lightroom. This tutorial is for those of you who are new to Lightroom and photo editing, and will help you understand the more focused editing tutorials in the future. We have chosen Lightroom as most of you will agree that it is a favorite among photographers and will benefit the majority of members on the group. Despite this though, if you edit using another popular program, please consider recording a tutorial video. Okay, so for this tutorial I will run through all the different adjustments one can do to an image and do my best to explain how they work. On the screen I have put up an image of a rhino that I will demonstrate all the adjustments one can do to an image. So on the left here you can find the presets. There are presets for color, creative presets and black and white presets, but we will be leaving that alone for this tutorial. So on the left I will run through all these panels here first, and then I will get to these top panels over here. So first off we have the basic panel. The temperature you can adjust. Please note that raw images are much easier to edit than JPEG images because the file information is still intact, and so things like the temperature, tint and exposure can be corrected and changed much easier. So first off, the temperature, which is how warm or cold the image is. So if you pull the slider to the left, you'll see that the image becomes more blue or cold, and if you move it to the right it becomes more warm or orange. If you double tap a slider, you'll see that it will return to 0. Tint, you'll see that moving it to the left will create a more green image, and moving it to the right will create a more purple image. Then with the tone, exposure, how bright or dark an image is, simply by moving this left or right you can adjust how bright the overall image is. Contrast, the difference between the highlights and shadows. So by increasing contrast you're going to create a bigger difference between the lighter and darker parts of an image, will make an image pop more, but you do not want to add too much contrast. Lessening the contrast will make the image look more flat, and there won't be a big difference between the light and dark parts of the image, which is definitely not what you want. Then highlights, which are the brighter parts of your image. So by moving this right you can increase your highlights. You'll notice that the brighter parts become even more brighter. This also helps in increasing contrast. Then the shadows, which are the darker parts of the image, and by moving this right you can increase exposure to the shadows, which will bring out details that have been lost in the shadows, and by decreasing it you will create more shadows in the image. Then whites. Whites are the extremely light parts of the image, which are basically white, and by increasing them you can make them brighter, put more white into the image, which will turn highlights into whites. And then blacks is the same thing, except the black parts of the image. By decreasing that you'll add more blacks to the image, and increasing it will decrease the blacks and make them a more grey color, which flattens out an image. Then in your presence, your texture, clarity and dehaze, these are all used to add detail to your image. So by increasing your texture, the overall texture of the image, you can see there's a bit more detail overall, and then decrease creates a more softer image. Clarity is similar to texture, except it's more focused on highlights and shadows of an image. And then dehaze, you'll find some areas of a picture where there are slight details. I find that it works to demonstrate it on pictures of clouds. If you add dehaze, you'll see it brings them out more. So if you increase dehaze, you'll see that the flatter parts of the image are given more contrast, and you'll see that it also affects the saturation. And then finally, vibrance and saturation. Vibrance, if you increase the vibrance, it brings out more subtle colors in an image and gives them more saturation, so you bring out more colors in an image. And then saturation just increases the strength of the colors that are already in the image. Okay, so that's it for the basic panel, and then up here you'll see if you just press on black and white, you'll convert the image into a black and white. Okay, now for tone curve. So the tone curve is used for increasing the exposure of an image in this gray panel, and up here you can see red, green and blue, which I will get to in a second. So here you'll see that, let me just reset this quickly. If you double tap on the image, you can reset it. Okay, so this part of the image up here that I'm pointing at here is the highlights, or the whites. This part is the highlights, this part is the whites, this part is the shadows, and then this part is the blacks of an image. So right about here in the middle is basically the midtones of the image. So what you can do here is, let's say I put a mark here, I click here and I pull up. This will increase the highlights of an image, so make those highlights brighter. And if I pull it down, I will decrease the exposure of the highlights. So for this image, you just want to increase it slightly and then leave the midtones as they are. And then right about down here is the shadows of the image, and by pulling them down you can increase the shadows a little bit. And what this basically does is, you can see it creates a little bit of an S-curve. Ooh, sorry about that. And that creates contrast in an image. So it's basically the same as the basic panel, although this has much greater control, as some of the things in the basic panel increase the image overall, and this one is much more focused. So you can just subtle changes go a long way on the tone curve. So then if you press on red, it's the same thing. So here are the highlights, midtones, shadows, blacks and whites at the top here. So if you pull up, you'll see we're in the red now. This basically will put more red color into the highlights. Double tap, put that back. Midtones, if I pull down on the midtones, then I'm decreasing red color from the midtones. So I think you get the picture. And then green, here are the shadows. If I pulled up here, I would be putting more green into the shadows of the image. Okay, now we have the HSL color sliders. So here you will have an options between hue, saturation and luminance. So hue is basically how certain colors look in an image. So if you pull this, you'll see this slider of the red is, if you pull it left, it becomes more pink, and if you pull it to the right, the reds become more orange. So that changes how the color appears in the image. Then saturation of those colors, you can decide how saturated you want those colors to be. By pulling it to the left, you will decrease saturation of that color, and by pulling it to the right, you will increase saturation of that color. Then luminance refers to the brightness of specific colors in your image. So by pulling the slider left, you will decrease the brightness of that color in the image, and by pulling it right, you will increase the color of that color in the image. Then we move to color grading. Color grading, you can basically control what colors there are at specific exposure levels in the picture. So here you'll see it says midtones, and then you'll see the colors around the circle. So basically, if you take that circle and pull it, you'll be towards a color. That's what the color you will be adding to the midtones. So let's say you wanted to add orange to the midtones, you'll drag to the orange. And then to decide how much saturation you want with that color, you pull back the circle. You'll see it there, a line forms, and you can see it says S23. So basically we're on 23 of orange in the midtones. So if you just double tap that, bring it back to 0. And then the shadows, you can add a color to the shadows, and then the same with the highlights. And then we have detail, which is basically sharpening. You don't want to add too much sharpening, otherwise the image starts getting a little bit grainy. And then masking, which basically the program Lightroom determines which parts of the image to sharpen with masking. It prefers lighter areas, highlights of the image, and not shadows. So if you take this slider and you press Shift Alt, so if you press Shift Alt and hold that slider and move it, the white parts of the image are the parts that the program will sharpen. So moving it to the right, you'll see adding more masking, it's going to sharpen less, and if you move it left, it's going to sharpen more of the image. Noise reduction. The grainy images, you want to add some noise reduction. It's very sensitive, so you don't want to add too much noise reduction to your image. Okay, close that. Then lens corrections. So chromatic aberration, for those of you who don't know, is sometimes the lens, you'll see at edges such as here where my mouse is, the edges of highlights sometimes get colors which are mostly are purple or green, which is referred to as chromatic aberration. And so this tool will help remove chromatic aberration and then enable profile corrections. So some specific lenses have certain problems such as vignetting and stuff like that, and so if you enable profile corrections, the program detects those problems and fixes them. So you'll have to select a make and select the lens that you want to correct over here. And then transform. So this is basically how the image appears on the axes. So if you want to transform it, you'll see vertical, moving it, stretching it up and down on the vertical axis, and then you can stretch it horizontally as well. And then rotate from left to right, you'll see here. And so when you transform an image, you'll see that sometimes you get these white areas because you're rotating it. And if you get these white areas, you'll see that there's an option here called constrain crop, which will remove those white areas and crop in on the image like that. So just take that back to 0, remove constraint crop, and then scale, you can basically add borders on the outside. Okay, close transform, then we move on to effects. So post-crop vignetting, if you move it to the left, you are basically going to add vignettes, which is darkening of the corners, and by adding it right, you're going to lighten the corners. So adding vignettes brings attention to the subject, and sometimes also brightening the edges can bring attention to the subject. It all depends on what you're trying to achieve with an image. The midpoint is where the vignette basically starts from towards the corner. So by decreasing the midpoint, the vignette is going to come more into the center of the image, and by moving it right, it's going to stick to more of the corners of the image. So if the subject is smaller in an image, like closer to the center, you're going to want to decrease the midpoint so the vignette is stronger and goes more towards the center. Feather is how much of how gradual the vignette is. So by adding feather, the vignette is going to be more gradual, so darker in the corners and then much lighter in the center. By decreasing feather, it's going to be the same all around. As you can see, when I decrease the feather, you can see that ring, that specific ring there, which you don't want. So you normally want to increase feather. Okay, and then of course you can add a little bit of grain if you want that sort of texture in your image. Okay, and then lastly we have calibration. So with the calibration, you'll see it has these sliders with hue and saturation. You might be thinking it's similar to the hue and saturation sliders at the top. It is similar, although it's not the same. So basically the camera puts a certain amount of red, green and blue in every pixel of the image. So every color in the image, every pixel is made up of red, green and blue. And so by increasing saturation of red, you're putting more red into every pixel in the image. So this can be used to create a look that you want. It's quite difficult to master, but it is very useful. And then the hue, of course, is how that color appears in the image. Okay, so that's these sliders done, and then we'll move on to the top here. So if you hover over this here on the right, it says adjustment brush. So this brush, you can paint over the image where you want to make selective edits. By rolling your mouse, the slider, you can increase and decrease the size of the brush, and you can make all the normal basic adjustments, sharpness, saturation, and texture, as well as temperature. And then if you move to the bottom here, you can see auto mask. Auto mask will basically sense edges on the picture, such as if we were to brush around this rhino here, it will sense the edges of the rhino and try to mask that out of the selective edit. You can also adjust the size manually over here, change the feather of the selective edit, and then if you move up here, you can change it. And then if you want to see what you have selected, like if I just do this, if I press, I'm making this selection, but you can't actually see what I've selected. So if you go over here where it says color and you press on this, you can select a color which will make a mask, and you can see which parts of the image you have selected. So if I've just dropped my pin here by the red, and then you can see what I've selected. So I'm painting here, and so that color shows me which parts of the image I have selected. So I'm just gonna edit, go at the top here, undo, brush stroke, undo toning hue, and undo add brush stroke. So that's done there. Okay, click on done. Then next we have a radial filter, which is another selective edit. Radial filter is circular, so if you press and drag outwards and inwards, you can change the shape of the circle, change the size, put inwards, and do that kind of thing. And then the same adjustments you could do with the brush are available here. And then you'll see also here it says invert. So normally the adjustments are inside the radial filter, and if you drag it you can change the position. So normally, as I was saying, normally the adjustments are inside the circle. If you press invert, then it's going to affect everything outside the circle. Click on done. Okay, so next up we have graduated filter, which is basically a linear filter in the image. So you can see if I come here and drag up, then I've selected this part at the bottom here. So I can drag up here, select more of the image, drag it back down, and then you'll see here, this part here, if I click and hold this line at the top here, I'm adding more feather. So that's how you add feather to the graduated filters. So now it's going to start by this line, it's going to start, and then it's going to affect all the way down here. So this is the part where the filter is going to be the strongest, and up here all the way to where we have this line, it's going to be the weakest. So you can make it more smooth or more of a feather by dragging this out. And then also if you go onto the main line, and you can see that arrow, and then you can rotate the graduated filter. Okay, press done. Okay, so next up we have red eye correction, which I won't go into now, but that's how you correct red eyes. And then spot removal. Spot removal is a very powerful tool. If you have little parts of an image that you feel that are a little bit distracting and you want to remove them, so if by rolling the mouse the same as the other things, you can increase the size, or you can do it manually over here. Heal, there's two options of the brush, heal and clone. Heal is focused on more of healing to make it look more like its surroundings. But if you select clone, it's going to take, so basically let me press here, I'll press there, then you'll see it's going to take this part over here and try heal that part with this part. So if you said clone, it's going to take the exact circle and place it right over there. It's going to literally clone the circle. But if you press heal, it's going to try and fix it but not clone it. So you can add feather from the edges, how much of that, how much feather you want, and then the opacity is how strong that heel is. So if you normally want it 100, but if you don't, then you can bring the opacity down and the heel won't be as obvious as it was. And then you can take this circle and drag it around from where you want it to heal from. So we wanted to heal that part, so we're going to take it from here, which is next to it, which looks pretty similar. So you can just drag this around and choose where you want to heal from. Okay, click on done. Okay, and then the last one we have crop overlay. So this is basically the crop of the image. So if you click on aspect here, you can see as shot, which is the original out of camera crop, also original, and then custom. If you press on custom, you'll see that you can change this side and this side, and it's not going to affect anything. So that's custom. You can change both sides. And then these are some specific ones that are already in place. So 1x1, which is basically a square. You've got 4x5, which is the Instagram portrait crop. 8x11, and then things like 16x9, which are pretty long ones. And then we'll just go back to original here. Bring that down. And then if you click here, you can actually drag the crop from side to side. Okay, click on done. And I think that's pretty much it for this tutorial. We've covered all the basics. I hope you understood those, all these sliders and the top here. So practice that, and I'm sure you'll be ready to handle a few more editing tutorials in the future. So if you guys have any things that you would like to contribute to editing tutorials, please feel free to contact us and we'll add them in the future. I hope that you guys enjoyed that, and see you next time.